Hello, I'm Alice Hutchinson, the owner of Birds Books, an independent bookstore in Bethel, Connecticut, and I am honored to be the host of Write America. The aim of this series is to help set the country back on a correct, productive course of freedom, justice, equality, and plain human kindness. Write America is a literary series created by author Roger Rosenblatt, featuring award-winning, nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers in readings and conversations each week about how books and art might bridge the deep divisions in our nation. Write America celebrates the quiet power of art in our lives, the unifying power of the highest uses of language. In novels, stories, essays, and poems, we recognize one another as parts of the human family, one family. Roger Rosenblatt, the creator of Write America, puts it this way: writing makes justice desirable, evil intelligible, grief endurable, and love possible. So welcome, and please join us for special events and for every Monday evening at this time, as many of the most beloved and distinguished writers in the country read from their works and talk to each other and with you in an effort to bring us together. If you missed Monday's episode with Juan Felipe Herrera and David Tomas Martinez, or any of the previous episodes of Write America, you can go to Birds Books Crowdcast channel and watch the recordings at any time. Tonight's episode is also being recorded, so if you missed something, you can go back and rewatch. Tonight, Birds Books hosts a special episode of Write America with Richard Ford and Bruce Weber as they honor E L Doctorow and his work. I will return after the discussion to bring any of your questions and comments to the authors. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with Crowdcast, you might have noticed the chat to the right. Please feel free to comment as the evening goes on. But if you have a question, at the bottom of your screen, there is an Ask a Question tab. That's where I will look for your questions. If there are none, we will allow the gentlemen to continue their discussions. There is also a tab at the bottom of the page that says Birds Books Write America page, so please check out the rest of our schedule. I will begin with introducing both our guests. Then Richard Ford will read from E L Doctorow, and Bruce Weber will join him on screen for a discussion. I will take any of your questions again at the end. Now a little about our guests, Richard Ford and Bruce Weber. Richard Ford is the author of The Sports Writer and Independence Day. He is the winner of the Prix Femina in France, the 2019 Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction, and the Princess of Asturias Award in Spain. He is also the author of the New York Times bestseller, Canada. His story collections include bestseller Let Me Be Frank with You, Rock Springs, and A Multitude of Sins. His book, Sorry for Your Trouble, was published last year. He lives in Booth Bay, Maine with his wife, Christina Ford. Tonight he will be reading from the Book of Daniel, which is celebrating its 50th year in print. Bruce Weber worked for the New York Times for 30 years as an editor, reporter, theater critic, and most recently, obituary writer. He began his career in publishing as a fiction editor at Esquire. He is the author of Life is a Wheel, Love, Death, etc., and A Bike Ride Across America, and As They See Him, A Fan's Travel in the Land of Umpires, a New York Times bestseller. His current project is the first full-length biography of E L Doctorow. E L Doctorow, his works of fiction include Welcome to Hard Times, The Book of Daniel, Ragtime, Loon Lake, World's Fair, Billy Bathgate, The Waterworks, City of God, The March, Homer and Langley, and Andrew's Brain. Among his honors are the National Book Award, 3 National Book Critics Circle Award, and 2 PEN/Faulkner Awards, and the presidentially confirmed National Humanities Medal. In 2019, he was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, International Prize, and in 2012, he won the PEN Saul Bellow Award for Achievement in American Fiction. In 2013, the American Academy of Arts and Letters awarded him the Gold Medal for Fiction. In 2014, he was honored with the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction, and he lived from 1931 to 2015. Please welcome to the script, Richard Ford.
Good evening from warm and sunny Billings, Montana, where the sun is, I can see, setting. The book of Daniel was, as Alice said, published 50 years ago this past spring. And it was E L Doctorow's third novel to be published, but it was his first novel to find a larger readership, which my friend Mr. Weber assures me was 16,215 copies. Edgar Doctorow was 40 years old then. This book was followed in 1975 by the phenomenon, which was ragtime. But it was the book of Daniel which made the world first pay close attention to E L Doctorow. Briefly, for those of you who have not read this wonderful book, the book of Daniel is a story told, or as the novel has it, written by Daniel Isaacson, also known as Daniel Lewin in this novel. It is his story, and it is the story of his parents and his sister in the late 1940s and early 50s in Bronx, New York. In particular, it is the story of his parents, Rochelle and Paul Isaacson, who are American communists and who are accused by their friend Selig Mindisch of spying for the Soviet Union, and who in 1951 are tried by the United States government for espionage and subsequently put to death. The well-documented espionage convictions and execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg are obviously not merely incidental to the narrative of the Book of Daniel, but Doctorow's novel stands entirely and memorably on its own. The story which embodies this novel, conceived by Doctorow, but again written, as is the novel's conceit, by Daniel Isaacson, a doctoral student at Columbia in 1968, is a howl of fierce despair. And it is also a record of Daniel's attempts to determine, among other things, if his parents were actually guilty of the crimes they were to pay so dearly for, and for which Daniel and his sister become orphans, and their lives possibly irredeemable, but for this story. The passage I'm going to read to you is from the Random House paperback, pages 184, 189, in case some of you want to read along. It describes the moments in Paul Isaacson's, Daniel's father's, first entry into the courtroom, where he will be tried for betraying his country. The lawyer is named Jake Asher. Rochelle Isaacson, Paul's wife, also accused of espionage, is already seated in the room. In the telling of this novel, Daniel Isaacson freely moves from the first to the third person narrative mode, sometimes even entering into the interior of other characters, as here with his father. But the novel is never less than completely accessible, which is enough to say about writerly back of the shop stuff. You simply must hear this book. His trial is held in a large shadowed hall. Voices echo, gestures are solemn, oratorical. In attendance are all the world's history of dead heroes of the left. But a small elevator brings him up from the basement lockup, and with one marshal in front of him and one holding his arm, he steps through the door into the courtroom, and the raised judge's bench is off his right eye. He sees a large square room, but a room, not a hall. And the raked jury box has leather chairs of green. The walls are wood paneled and the same dark wood of the balustrade which separates the trial area from the spectators' pews. The floors are marble. The back doors look padded and have porthole windows. As he enters, no one seems to notice. He sits and he waits. Asher touches his arm and speaks quietly into his ear, and on the other side of Asher, Rochelle writes on a pad. He is bewildered, and his own visions have made him vulnerable. Ordinary people move about the room on obscure business. There are few spectators. He turns in his chair and cannot tell who is press. Everyone looks the same. Everyone is sallow in the light of the courtroom, which is a mixture of daylight and the incandescence of wheat bulbs. At the same time, voices seem metallic. The acoustics of the room are not good. He is reminded of what? A library. a legitimate theater with the fire curtain down, a doctor's office, an indoor swimming pool. He feels slightly ill. He recognizes the feeling, a cavern opening inside him, a cavern of fear, and closing his eyes, he sees in its darkness, and it has no bottom. When the judge comes in from his own door on the other side of the bench and quickly takes his seat, Paul, having been gently suffered to stand on his feet, takes a deep breath. It is to seal the cavern of his nauseating fear. Everyone sits, and the judge, like a businessman starting his day, commences the trial in an efficient, quiet, conversational voice. He does not look down at Paul. He addresses only the lawyers. It is Judge Hirsch. Not having known of his existence even a few short months ago, Paul knows a good deal more about him now, including Hirsch's most intimate professional secret that he hopes to be appointed to the Supreme Court. All the lawyers in the corridor know this. Hirsch has heard more cases brought by the government in the field of subversive activities than anyone else. He is Jewish. He wears a striped Ivy League tie, the knot of which can be seen under his judicial robe. Paul realizes that he has to adjust the reality of the situation. Howard Red Furman, the chief U.S. attorney, is a thin, boyish fellow with freckles and thin, sandy red hair and a tenor voice. He is younger than Paul expected, perhaps his own age, and he too wears a Glen plaid suit, a brownish tone, although his fits him better. Furman is a war hero. He commanded a destroyer. His career has been meteoric. He is a graduate of St. John's and is married to an Irish girl and has 7 children. Paul runs his hand through his hair. He quickly tightens the knot at his collar. He wishes at this moment, and it is unbelievable to him, and it shames him, but he wishes at this moment he could be back in his cell. On the window ledge under the bars, he keeps the shoebox with his letters from Rochelle and the children, and his hairbrush, and his toilet articles, and the cigar box with his collection. He has a very good way of folding the extra blanket at the foot of his cot. He might be having a chat now with Doyle, the day guard, a very decent man who has had much sorrow in his life. But you can see that is a part of it too, the enforced isolation, the sapping of confidence, so that being with other people in a room without bars is suddenly a terrifying thing. They are counting on just the feelings I am feeling. Now I will show them they can count on nothing. Nevertheless, he feels he's lost something, even in the few minutes he's been here. A run scored for the other team. Asher is now up at the bench with Furman, and he looks to his left across Asher's empty chair and catches Rochelle studying him worriedly. Behind them, fitting in through the rear doors of the court, are the people from whose numbers a jury will be chosen. Surely it is ridiculous to suppose that anyone, even one communist, is among them. He wants to reach out, to touch Rochelle's hand. He puts down the urge. They have agreed to be calm, dignified, and under no circumstances make of themselves spectacles for the watching eyes of the press. To show no emotion, to give no satisfaction, to provide no hearts with occasions for scorn or pity. Not pity, but justice is what they will have. And not by groveling for it, but by demanding it. They have worked it all out. Rochelle has been very emphatic on this point. He must clear his head and keep cool. What matters is that he maintain his faculties to analyze the situation and assess it correctly and do what has to be done on the basis of that assessment. He understands that the trial will be held in recognizable New York accents. His adversaries are human beings with jobs to do. They will do their jobs, feeling that they honor the standards of justice. An American flag, a beautiful flag with gold fringe, hangs from a pole, which is socketed at a stand behind the judge's bench. I am to be presented as an enemy of this flag. Yet Mrs. Goldman, my fourth grade teacher, told me, all of the children in the class, that I had the finest, straightest salute and was and was commended to the notice of the other children. The way Paul stands, children, that is the way to stand, nice and tall and with a straight back when you say the Pledge of Allegiance. The marvelous Mrs. Goldman, the marvelous smell of the classroom on rainy days, with all the raincoats and rubbers, a schoolroom on a rainy day, steamy with wet raincoats in the closet and wet rubbers, the windows fogged with steam, the rain dripping down the outside of the windows, the hot lunch program, the hot soup. To each other, the teachers spoke Yiddish, which was ridiculous because 9/10 of all the children were Jewish and they understood Yiddish from their mothers and fathers, from their grandfathers, the maps that pulled down like shades, the watercolors of Washington and Lincoln and Coolidge, framed in glass high on the walls. All societies indoctrinate their children. The marvelous Mrs. Goldstein, in total innocence, taught us the glorious history of our brave westward expansion, our taming of the barbaric Indians, our brave stand at the Alamo, the mighty railroads winning the plains. Thus, I must understand the nature of the conspiracy against us. It is mounted in full faith and righteousness by the students of Mrs. Goldstein. He begins to feel better. His stomach is settling. The long, drawn-out process of picking jurors has begun. He sits with his hands clasped on the edge of the table. He does not stare too intensively at each of these people who may decide his fate. His personal manner will offend no one. His mind is working, and he is no longer stunned. He feels the satisfaction of a soldier having done everything necessary to prepare himself for battle. It is a moment of clarity and exhilaration. My darling, whoever is looking will think I am writing a note on some legal aspect to Asher. I will pass it to him, and he will pass it over to you. You look so pale, my sweetheart. Don't be afraid. Don't you know your girl longs for you with a love that is indestructible? Look up and you will see me smiling at you. It is as she says. He smiles, and at this moment all the fear backs up on him. And the treacherous muscles of his smile mean to betray him and cause him to cry out. He swallows this dreadful feeling, swallows the terror, tastes it, gulps it. Oh, Rochelle, oh, my darling, do you know what? There is no one behind us. I have checked, not a face we know, neither Frida nor Ruth nor anyone from the Concourse Jefferson Club. We are absolutely alone. Who is the higher authority? Who do I call? Who saves me? The muscles of let me out. The muscles of they can't do this to me. When the cell door first closed, I thought it would open if I tried it. They actually locked me in a cell. They actually do that. Put someone in a place so that he can't get out. It is done. And the same people who have put me in here are trying me. What can I expect of a trial conducted by the same people who have arrested me and put me in their jail? The wish to get out, it is a terror that makes me rigid. The muscles in your arms, your sphincters, the cords of your sex, your body winds up on itself. It all tightens and begins to radiate this tremendous, fearful energy that attaches to nothing. You smear electrons on the cell block. You melt the palms of your hands on the bars. The more insane and infuriating and ridiculous the fact that you must stay here in this cage, the more it is true. With every minute that passes, it becomes more terrifyingly insane and more true. And finally, you reach the point when you realize that the situation is contrived to make you realize you are your own enemy. The muscles of let me out will destroy you. You have to untangle them, unhitch them from the rage in your throat, loosen them from the mind, slack your ropes. At the moment you slack your ropes and begin to breathe, you begin to do time. That is the name the inmate community gives to this adjustment, doing time. You begin the process of outlasting the animosity of those who have put you here. You destroy the time in your life, the minutes and the hours, scorch them with your own indifference, make them valueless to yourself before they do it for you. As the Red Armies retreated before Hitler, burning the earth behind them, their own earth, their own crops, their own fruition, so that it would not fall in its living rightness to them. This morning, when they came to take me to my trial, every man in the cell block wished me luck. So, that is to hear the book of Daniel. How lucky you are to know this book and have a chance to read it again if you've not read it. Now, do read it again. After reading this now, and after having you hear it, I want to say a few things about what a magnificent novel this really is. I read it again this past month after not having opened it for 50 years, and I was dazzled. And I would like to say what I noticed. Possibly these are just writerly features that wouldn't be discussed in the classroom or in a book group. And maybe Bruce wants to arrive and talk about this book with me.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, Bruce. Nice to see you.
Yeah, ditto.
Bruce and I are friends.
Well, I would like to hear what you would. Sorry, I'm sitting in front of my light here. I would like to hear what you, as a novelist, have to say about reading this book after 50 years. I mean, you've been writing your own novels for 50 years.
Yeah.
Thanks
to Mr. Doctorow.
As a biographer and and basically as a journalist and as a reader, I suspect my experience with this book is different from yours. So why don't you talk from the novelist's point of view, and then I'll check in.
Okay. As I was reading the book, I just kept making notes in the front. And of the things that I really admired. And, ipso facto, it's from a novelist's point of view, because that's what I am. I gloried in the sheer bravado of this book's premise. To write about the children from the standpoint of the children whose parents are being tried for espionage and ultimately electrocuted. And to try to bring to bear the inquiries that Daniel brings to bear seemed to me to be a remarkable undertaking. I noticed the canny decision to make the book be so much about the Isaacsons before their world exploded, which ultimately affords this howl of despair of a book with a significant amount of poignancy. It's a remarkably, for all of its violence and all of its intensity, it's a remarkably poignant book when you read it. I noticed Edgar's willingness to bring his own new intelligence to the conventions of history. I noticed the novel's sort of breathless intensity, start to finish. I noticed how utterly in command of his idiom Doctorow was, or to put it differently, how completely Edgar Doctorow fits as the author of his book, how free his reference is widening of the frame of reference he is able to achieve, as if he were born to write this novel.
Yeah, well, say, you know, among other things, you got the history of the Russian Communist Party in this book.
Yeah. Oh my God! And it never feels when you're reading it that he's sort of offloading history into the book.
Yeah,
the book totally intercalates everything that history has to add. And I'll say two more things. I noticed the absolute lack of irony in this book's vision. The book is full of all kinds of situational ironies and sarcasms, but there is, for this book, the presumption that there is importance in life, and some things simply mean what they mean. And in a way, to me, that is its most notable achievement, that it is not an ironic book about a subject which to take on directly would be almost impossible. Wow.
You know, from my perspective, the book is, you know, the book, I'm sorry, the lights in my room keep going off and on.
You living in a barn?
What? No, I'm in my apartment. I don't quite understand what's going on. To me, the book is remarkable for the amount that it accomplishes. At the same time, you know, as I said, that, you know, you get the history of the Russian Communist Party, the triumph of Stalin, and the American, you know, the 30s radicals, in the United States, and their first, you know, attachment to Stalin, and then their disillusionment, and then you get the contrast with the 1960s radicals and their attention to civil rights and anti-government, you know, and the anti-authoritative government in the United States. And one of the interesting things about the book is that Doctorow began this with a kind of a philosophical idea. It didn't start from a character. It didn't start from a situation. It started from his interest in the difference between 30s radicalism and 60s radicalism. And he hit upon the...
Go back, Bushy. Something got lost in the last thing you said. His interest in... Something got lost in the last thing.
His interest in the difference between 30s radicalism and 1960s radicalism. And he, you know, decided that the place where those two things intersected was in the trial and execution of the Rosenbergs. And so, unlike a lot of novels, this began with an intellectual theme, an intellectual idea, which is, you know, kind of unusual for novels that are, at least for novels that are considered. I mean, I've heard most novelists say that this is not, you know, that this is sort of death. And in fact, Doctorow would, who was often accused of being a political novelist, you know, has often said, if you're writing about politics, if that's what your idea is, you know, you're not writing a good book.
When I use the term, the book is an idea book, I mean it as derogatory.
Yeah. But I think this book was, you know, and he talked about this book as being about the two great periods of American radicalism. But I think the great accomplishment of the book is that it becomes a book about a character. Yeah. I mean, it becomes a book about Daniel Isaacson, and what a complicated character, you know, he actually is, and what Edgar, this is to use your term, Richard, what Edgar makes him do. He is, you know, he isn't what you would call a nice person. In fact, he's, you know, he spends a great deal of time tormenting his wife, tormenting the foster parents that have been nothing but incredibly kind to him, arguing with his mentally ill sister who was about to kill herself. I mean, the anger in Daniel is palpable, and yet he is a remarkably sympathetic person. I mean, he's a jerk that you root for, which is quite an accomplishment when when you think about it.
Well, for those people who are in book clubs, and I don't mean this in a dismissive way, but when someone is complaining to you about, well, I didn't like this character very much, or this character doesn't seem really to be very likable, who cares?
Yeah.
I mean, use the book as this book is eminently usable for human reasons, not just for.
Well, it isn't about for me, it's never about likability. It's always about is this person interesting? You can be a jerk and still be interesting, and I think Daniel, Daniel certainly fulfills that. Fulfills both of those qualities. Yeah. But let me back off for a second, Richard, before we go back to the book of Daniel. One of the interesting parallels here in this whole discussion is that more than half a century ago, we haven't said this before, in this forum, is that you were Edgar's student, that Edgar taught you at the University of California at Irvine. It was Edgar's first teaching job. And the parallel here is that, of course, that I was your student.
And you were a good one. You were now.
Almost 50 years ago. Right. The difference is that when Edgar taught you, you were already a writer. This was in graduate school, and when I took your class, I wasn't yet one, and hadn't yet decided to be one. But so let me ask a couple of things. One, what was Edgar like as a teacher? Because as it happens, he went from that job to several other teaching jobs. And unlike a lot of novelists of his stature, and there aren't too many others that I can think of, you being among them, he taught his whole life. And second, what influence did he have on you as a writer, as his teacher, if he had any influence at all?
He did. He most certainly did. Certainly his work did. It was 1969, the year of to take LaBianca murders, the year of Woodstock. Nixon was the president. We were all, those of us in the tiny little new graduate program at Irvine, a little stunned by life at the time. And into our life walks this New Yorker who was a bit shy in some ways, restrained, friendly at a distance, who affected a kind of a delicate carriage, who often seemed amused, though never in an off-putting way. He seemed to have a lot behind it, everything he said, a lot of thought, and he entertained our work very, very seriously. I mean, the level of attention that he paid to our work was extremely valuable to us, because it basically said to us, you should pay this kind of attention to your work if this man who's come all the way
you faded out there.
From New York is going. He knew that he'd been in the business because he'd been the editorial director. Okay, am I back in? Am I back in?
Yeah. Now you're back in. Okay.
Well, I don't. Okay. We knew he'd been in the publishing world, that he'd been the editorial director of the Dial Press, and so we knew that his dicta had those kinds of dimensions in our life. We also learned from him, and he never talked about his work. We didn't know what he was writing. We certainly didn't know that he was writing the book of Daniel, which he was doing. He was finishing it in the year that we were his students in 1969-70. But there was a wonderful anecdote that we all knew, and A.B. Edgar told us this, about how he managed to work a serious job in publishing and write a novel, which was that he came home after work and he had dinner with his family, and he connived with his family until about 9 o'clock, and then he went to bed. He went to sleep. And then at about 11 o'clock or 11:30, he got up and he went up to the third floor of their house on Broadway Avenue in New Rochelle, and he worked till 2 o'clock in the morning, and then he went back to bed. And he got up in the morning and he went back down to the city. And that's a story you don't ever forget. I mean, not that I want to do that. God knows I don't want to do that and didn't want to do it at the time. But it seemed to me that he was possessed of a zeal and a sense of vocation that was imprinting on me and imprinting on, and indeed on all of us. I mean, apart from that, he told us one time, he said, always listen to that little editor in the back of your head, because that editor may not be right or wrong, but you have to listen to it. And I've never put something down, finished something, when I had a little voice in the back of my head that said, don't do that. And apart from that, what your writing teachers teach you is not how to write, but they teach you how to conduct yourself. They teach you how not to be a bore to others about your writing. They teach you how not, it's important, how not to compete with your colleagues, how somehow to take pleasure when someone does well, even if you're not doing well. He isn't to say that he was a model for us, because I don't think he thought he was a model for anybody, but in his deportment, he did effect a kind of lesson for us. So that's what it was like. That's what it was like to be a student. To what he did to influence me. There are a lot of things that don't have to do with what he talked about in class. I actually wrote down some things that I thought, because I was nice to think about what Edgar had done that affected my life. I had a story that I wrote in the workshop that he kind of liked, and he had up till then more or less given me to believe that he thought I was a kind of ordinary schlepper of a writer, fairly unimaginative, fairly unadventurous, and I guess in some ways it got under my skin. And so I wrote a story which really didn't have its parts fit together very well, and he loved it. And I thought to myself, and he likes it, as he says in his many interviews, he likes mystery. He likes things that don't fit together. He thinks of fictions as a composition, sort of like Ruskin says. Ruskin says composition is the arrangement of unequal things. And so Edgar liked the arrangement of unequal things. And that was very useful to me, to not to have to think that everything has to fit perfectly. He liked mystery and the plumbing of mystery, as you can see in all of his books. Another thing I suppose he did, this is through his work, not through his teaching. When Updike died, Adam Gopnik wrote a wonderful eulogy about John. And one of the things that Gopnik said about Updike was that he managed through the course of his writing life to get himself fully expressed. And if you read the book of Daniel, one of the things, and you said it 10 minutes ago, the book of Daniel is a book whose author is fully expressed. It is full. It is a complete, thorough experience. All of your possible questions are answered. All of your possible curiosities are addressed. And you can write, as a young writer particularly, books that do not fully express yourself. And I'm not talking about writing about yourself. I'm talking about
which Edgar really didn't do very much.
No, he didn't do it well.
Edgar did not.
Who knows? He didn't seem to.
Well, he did. There's a couple of books that he copped to being, at least semi-autobiographical. I mean, World's Fair takes his young childhood and uses it as the stuff for fiction. I mean, and he would say that most of what you read in World's Fair, is true. And Lives of the Poets is about a novelist, the mind of the novelist at age 50, and Edgar has copped to the fact that, he was writing about, sort of a generic novelist, but he was using himself as the exemplar,
yes.
as the exemplar of that. But aside from those two books, it's actually kind of difficult to locate Edgar in his novels. You passed along this quote to me from from from
From
his
Elliot.
Paris Review interview, in which he says all experience, most of it, that experience is bad. That he hasn't had any experience. And I think that's go ahead. I'm sorry. That I think that one of the things about
tongue-in-cheek.
But yes, but one of the things about Edgar as a writer is that all his books are completely different from all of his other books, and that and that is a function of not having had terribly dramatic experience to write about. He wasn't a bullfighter. He didn't travel. He didn't travel the world. He wasn't a big drinker. One of the things that he said was he has several vices, but one of them is moderation, which is about what.
Do you think as his biographer that the fact that the books are so distinct, one to the next, and 15 or so fiction books, is that a problem for you in trying to?
Sure, it is. Sure it is. But it's also interesting. It makes you into a kind of detective to see where the to figure out where the imagination comes from. I mean, and if you dig a little bit deeper into Edgar's into Edgar's life, there are bits and pieces in in every book from his life. I mean, he gives just to go back to the Book of Daniel. The Rosenbergs lived on the Lower East Side, but in the Book of Daniel, the Isaacsons live in Edgar's apartment, and the apartment that Edgar grew up in in the Bronx. So there's a lot of that stuff in Edgar's books, and that's fun. That's fun to dig, to ferret out. But he never seems to be writing about his own life.
Eliot has a wonderful remark. There's a wonderful remark in Tradition and the Individual Talent, in which he says, talking about poetry, but he says that poetry is not self-expression; it's actually an attempt to escape yourself.
Yeah, and I think Edgar agreed with that. One of there's I've been looking through his papers for some mention of an event that was really a dramatic event in his life, and I have never found it. In his freshman year at college, he went to Kenyon College, and in his freshman year, in February of that year, there was a catastrophic fire on campus, and 9 students were killed, including several that he knew. And it appears nowhere in his fiction. A fire appears, of that sort appears nowhere in his fiction, and I find that kind of astonishing. That that sort of an event. I mean, I haven't, I haven't come across any mention of it in any of his letters. I think he mentions it. Kind of in passing once or twice in a couple of essays that he wrote about being at Kenyon. But you would think that as a novelist, that sort of event would have found its way into his creative life, and it doesn't seem to.
Well, I'll put on my white coat as Dr. Freud here, and say. That it left in him, whatever that experience was, a residue of experience, of emotion, a residue of reaction, and being ultimately a novelist possibly made that residue, that reservoir, accessible to him in other narrative forms, so that he didn't have to draw on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my point is that for a biographer, kind of tracing the origins of ideas and of thought is, at least in the case of a guy like Edgar, who didn't write about his own life, it becomes more complicated. It becomes more difficult, but also more interesting, I think. And I'm having a lot of fun with it. I mean, you had asked me a couple days ago whether what were the books that Doctorow that made Doctorow think were were the possibilities of the novel. And when Doctorow was asked about his influences, he usually had a long list, but I always thought it was a kind of an interesting list because I would never have associated, say, Hawthorne with Edgar, and yet Hawthorne was a very big figure in his life. One of the very first things that he wrote after getting out of college was a play called The Birthmark, which was a rewrite of an updating of a Hawthorne story about a scientist who marries a beautiful girl, a girl who is is uncommonly beautiful, except that she has a one imperfecting birthmark on her cheek. And he becomes obsessed with this and finally manages to figure out a way to make the birthmark disappear. And of course, his wife dies as a result. Well, Edgar wrote a play about a science professor who marries an uncommonly beautiful girl with a birthmark, and he set it at Kenyon College. And and I thought, interesting that's how his his initial college reading set him off on this path. By the way, what many people may not know is that Edgar started out his writing life wanting to be a playwright.
Yeah, and screenwriter even.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed.
And much later in his life, he rewrote and updated a Hawthorne story called Wakefield, which appeared in the New Yorker and is one of, and it was actually made into a movie with Bryan Cranston, about a man who comes home from work one day and decides just not to go home, and he sets up doesn't go into his house, but he sets up camp in his garage.
What you were saying about him not writing about his own experience, at least not apparently writing about his own experience. He certainly wrote through the agency and the scrim of his emotional life and his reactive life to the world. He certainly wrote about society in ways that he cared about society, about who survives and who doesn't in society. But for a young writer such as I was, to encounter a series of books which are both different from each other and also apparently not drawn out of the life of their authors, it's a hugely influential thing to have happen to you. Because what it means is, that unlike what Hemingway said, wrongly, I think, write about what you know, you can at least think that what I know is what I can embrace. I can know what I can acquire, not necessarily that what I know is what I was born with, as Van Woodward says, dependent upon the accidents of origin. And then that's what he did. I mean, you have to have a certain sweet spot in material that lets you embrace it, but it doesn't have to be, what your grandma said when you were 18 that lived with you forever and therefore set you on the way to being a novelist. He was alive in the world and was embracing the world in ways that his novels benefited from.
Yeah,
hugely effective to me.
One other thing that you and I have discussed in the past is the whole idea of a writer's voice and of a story's voice. You and I haven't always agreed about this, but
I've always been right, though.
What? Some writers, you just know who it is. Some you just know who it is, who's writing from a sentence or a paragraph. From the sound of of the language. You become attuned to the writer's music. Particularly writers that you like. But one of the things that interests me about Edgar's work is that even after I've been engaged with it now for a few years in a very intense way, I can't identify it. I can't describe what I would call as his style. I mean, his prose is always sonorous. It's always lovely. I mean, it's never, I never find it clunky or
No,
I
he
just don't,
inhabits his idiom.
I just don't find it individuated somehow. It's not, um, I can't describe his, I mean, for lack of a better word, his style.
Yeah, yeah.
If I say that to you, how do you, as a novelist, how do you react about that? Am I wrong about Edgar, or am I
No,
simply wrong about novelists?
no, you're not wrong. You're not wrong about either of those. Either of those things. I mean, his books have different voices. All of us, all human beings, talk to the world, and that's what novelists do on the page. Talk to the world in different ways. We talk to our shrink in one way, we talk to our wife in another way, we talk to our priest in another way, we talk to our colleagues at work in another way. Novelists just have a specific use to make of that multilingual quality that we all have. I mean, voice to me, and I've thought about it a lot. I mean, people say they think in a complimentary mode that I can always tell a sentence of yours, not of mine, but of somebody, of Ray Carver or of Hemingway,
Right.
As if it were a compliment. I never thought it was a compliment that somebody could say that they could always hear me or hear someone. Ray Carver was that way. People used to say about Ray Carver, I could always hear and know it was Ray Carver. No, actually, you can't. That's a logic chopping that goes on for the reader's benefit. Voice, I think of voice as being the music of the story's intelligence, and it is most audible when the story is doing, or this novel is doing, something that it most seriously undertakes, and it has
Well,
to.
I'm sorry. I was going to say that brings me back to the Book of Daniel, because as you know, Edgar said that when he first started the book, he had 150 pages of the Book of Daniel that he just decided stunk, and he threw them out. And I found the first, as it happens, just today, I found 50 pages of that first 150 pages, and they didn't stink at all, but they were. He said that they were, as he described them, they were straightforward third-person narrative, and actually written kind of in the present tense, and it was the beginning of the book, and I read them today, and I thought, and what Edgar finally said was, he was so pissed off that after he threw out those pages, that he just kind of sat at his typewriter and he was typing, nonsense. He was just recording what he had on his desk. This is a thin line number two pen from the Long Island Ink Company, and that what he realized as he was writing was that he was finding the voice of the book. That
you could hear it.
What he was writing was Daniel's voice, and he said, Daniel should write the book, not me.
Right, which is a conceit, of course.
Yes, and if you go back and you look at these the first original pages. By the way, the original title of the book was "Save the Isaacsons," according to this manuscript, which is,
well, we can all be forgiven for our first bad titles.
But
what did you know? What that voice was register, was diction, was rhetoric, insofar as who he thought he was addressing, and it was all of those things for that particular book.
Yep. Well, I think that one of the things that he discovered was that's how he was going to go ahead with his career. I mean, his first book was fairly successestful, which was about which was a Western that was written in the voice of a Western of a Western traveler and mayor and kind of a sheriff.
Welcome to Hard
But
Times.
Edgar, yeah, but Edgar had never been, west of the Mississippi when he wrote it.
I think, in fact, I'll say parenthetically that when Edgar was hired to teach us at the University of California at Irvine back in 1969, he was hired by a wonderful man named Oakley Hall. And Oakley Hall was from San Diego and had gone to Berkeley and had written a wonderfully successful novel in the 50s called Warlock. And he loved Western writing. He loved Wally Stegner. And I think that when he hired Edgar, who was at that moment writing the Book of Daniel, he hired him because he thought he was a Western writer. He hired him because he thought he was going to write more Westerns. He was very dismally surprised because when Edgar got to Irvine, what he turned out to be was a kind of a wild-eyed radical who got behind all of the student protests and got behind the anti-war movement on the UC campus at that time, and completely alienated himself from all of the other faculty members who were kind of scratchy and conservative, and let them all down.
That sounds about like Edgar. But
I think we're getting to the end of our.
Well, okay. What I was going to say was that when he discovered Daniel, I think that he was going back to the original success of Welcome to Hard Times, which was written by a narrator, by someone that was apart from Edgar. The book that he wrote in between, Big as Life, which was a disaster as far as Edgar was concerned, was a straightforward third-person narrative. And he never
mentioned it in my presence.
Oh, well, he has never allowed it to be reprinted. It's a strange, interesting book, but not a very good one. But I think one of the things that he recognized was that he needed to separate himself from the narrator of his books, and that and I think if you go through his novels, you'll see that there's a kind of distance between the author and the narrator that is really pretty easy to define, and it's one of the things that that made him so successful, and also made his books often sort of commentaries on the act of writing itself. So,
well, when you have that kind of a distance to deal with, I'll say this and I'll say no more. I don't want the last word, but I guess I'm going to have it. That distance allows you to get in more stuff. That may be the interior of that character or the quality of that character wouldn't necessarily accommodate, but that the man who's writing the book needs to get in to get fully expressed.
Gentlemen, thank you. I do have one question that was asked in the question tab, and this is a question from Anne and George. And for Richard Ford, as a writing teacher, I'm interested in what Doctorow taught you about teaching and whether you've applied it in your own teaching.
Show up. You do ultimately learn how to conduct a class. I don't teach workshops. I teach classes in literature. But I guess the thing he taught me to be serious is to respect the material that you're teaching. And to respect the people who are there with you in the room. There was no one lesson he taught me about teaching, other than, as I said, to show up and be all there, to let this be what you are doing that day, and to respect the material and to respect the students. As I said earlier, he taught us how to conduct ourselves.
I can, as Richard's student, I can say that he did that. He did that.
I had had
Actually,
read
in
by
some ways.
the time I taught you.
No.
Well, gentlemen, I could go on. It would be very easy for us to listen to you for another hour or two. And I want to thank you both for your time here tonight. I am going to sign off from Right
Thank you.
America. Thank you.
Bruce.
Thank you to Richard and Bruce for participating in Right America this evening, and to everyone who tuned in tonight. And thank you, Roger Rosenblatt, for creating an original and important series we can look forward to each Monday evening and on special events such as tonight. This concludes our last episode of Right America in 2021. We resume in 2022 on Monday, January 3rd with Sequoia Nagamatsu, Carla Brundage, and Lance Morrow. From all of us at Right America, we wish you a joyful holiday season and look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thank you very much.